The top three Frankenstein movies would include the original Frankenstein from 1931, James Whale's Frankenstein. Then a few years later, Whale again directed The Bride of Frankenstein, which many people consider, many critics anyway, consider it to be the numero uno superior Frankenstein-related film. The third one would be the 1957 Curse of Frankenstein, directed by Terence Fisher, that Hammer Studios produced. And what makes all three of these movies unique is not only the fact that they're of high quality, but when the James Whale, the very first one, 1931, starring Boris Karloff as the monster. But that movie really pushed a lot of boundaries at the time. It looks very tame to us today, but at some of the showings in the 1930s, there were people who were fainting. There were people who were going to the hospital because they were freaked out. They were so scared. Nobody had ever seen anything like that before. And oddly enough, too, there were a number of scenes that were censored from the original version. The 1931 Frankenstein, featuring Boris Karloff as the monster and Colin Clive as Victor von Frankenstein, that film, directed by James Whale, was actually censored before its release due to one of the lines that Victor Frankenstein utters, "I am God," or something to that effect, and then they thought that that would be offensive to a lot of people back then. When the monster starts to move, he's like, "I am God," and so there's this, throughout it, the story is man or human beings tampering with nature, and the story itself is still very relevant, especially to today's society with genetic engineering, cloning, all, the mixing of pigs and cows or whatever, is being done in some dark laboratory. I mean, this, people are doing these things, and the question that Shelley's novel and the story itself, regardless of the various permutations and adaptations, is, should we even be doing this? Are we messing with nature in a way that's going to be detrimental to us in the long run? And I think the story has much more relevance today than it did in the 1800s or even the early 20th century than ever before. And so that's why I think it's really important that students read this and wrestle with some of these concepts. But getting back to the films, there was another scene where the monster is playing with a young girl and he inadvertently kills her, not understanding what's happening, and that was completely censored. I'm not even sure if that footage still exists. I know that in the recent re-releases on DVD, they added the footage of "I am God," or "I've become a god," or "I've done the work of God." Don't remember the exact line, but it's something like that. But like I said, it's very interesting that the movie, the original one, really had people freaked out. Nobody had ever seen this before. Now, 1935's Bride of Frankenstein brought Boris Karloff back as the monster and Colin Clive back as Victor von Frankenstein, and thinking that, okay, the monster needs a mate was the tagline. But using Elsie Lancaster as she plays the dual role as the bride and as Mary Shelley, who is sort of discussing her inspiration behind the story. It's kind of interesting. She didn't create the Bride of Frankenstein, Mary Shelley, originally, but they put her in the movie as a character talking about Frankenstein. But that movie in many ways is very superior. In that movie, we see the monster of Frankenstein speaking. We see that the monster has some kind of intellect, and you really sympathize with the monster. Suddenly the monster becomes kind of charming in a way, but still ugly. And when the bride is born and life is put into her, she won't want anything to do with the monster. He's ugly. He's gross. There's still that concept of beauty and not being able to look beyond it. And if you look at Elsie Lancaster, as the bride, she's not that ugly, you know, as opposed to, say, Bride of Reanimator or something like that, or Frankenstein's Daughter. Third really classic Frankenstein movie is 1957's Curse of Frankenstein, starring Sir Christopher Lee as the monster and the great Peter Cushing as Victor von Frankenstein. Produced by Hammer Films and was one of the first in-color Frankenstein movies. And what is great about the Hammer era of horror, which goes from about 1957 to about 1978, but their golden age is 57 to 70, although they did make some great movies after that, was that The Curse of Frankenstein was really the defining moment for Hammer horror and the stylish kind of horror movie, the really gothic. And while they were low budget films, they presented themselves as high budget films, if that makes any sense. And very stylish, good acting, good scripting. Most of the Hammer films are really top notch, and I would argue really hold up today, even for today's audiences. But that was sort of the second wave of Frankenstein. We had the Frankenstein of the 30s, and with Karloff and a bunch of spin-offs. And then for a while there wasn't that much going on with the character of Frankenstein's monster and Victor von Frankenstein. And then Curse of Frankenstein comes and just hits everybody like a brick and becomes enormously successful, both in Europe and here in the United States. And there's a good reason. It's not a very good adaptation of the novel. None of those films are. 1973's Terror of Frankenstein is actually the truest adaptation of the novel, but you know, it kept the monster and the Frankenstein story in the public eye, and it's never really gone away from the public eye. So the three movies that I would argue are the best are Frankenstein 1931, Bride of Frankenstein 1935, and Curse of Frankenstein 1957. The best adaptation, however, was 1975's Terror of Frankenstein, directed by Calvin Ford, starring nobody that anyone would even know today, including me. But it is the truest sort of adaptation of the novel. Even though there was in 73 Frankenstein, the True Story, and a number of BBC miniseries based on the novel, The Terror of Frankenstein holds up as being the definitive adaptation of Shelley's novel. Not the definitive film, but the definitive adaptation in terms of being truest to the story.